There's a whole chapter on also where Bracher talks about how historicism can be an impediment to radical pedagogy. It's a really hard chapter to understand, but the two things that I clearly understood and which I would like to talk about here is that, okay, one aspect of it is that if we historicize, and that famous phrase, which comes from Frederick Jameson, is always historicize, right, when you're teaching literary texts. So what he says is that, okay, if we are using just the mainstream history, it is impacting students in two ways, right? So the students from a dominant group will internalize that as the real, because history offers itself as real, right? Not as discursive or produced. So they would then start defining their own identities in relation to this textual knowledge, which they consider real, instead of, being in the symbolic order. But two, it also creates distance between them and the past actions that the dominant group might have done, right? So by looking at it historically, then they can convince themselves, well, I am not that part of that. This happened in the past. It is done. People shouldn't be complaining about it. I'm not responsible for it. That's one thing that happens. So it hardens that identity. The second is that even if we include the forgotten histories, right, the bruised knowledge, what Foucault called, it can have also a drastically negative impact, let's say, on people whose histories are being included, the feminists, the women, right, the minorities, because if that's the only history that is offered, then they will start defining their identities only through that history, right, by jettisoning the mainstream or other history, and it will harden their own identities into that kind of specific group identity. And an extreme form of it would be where you just define your identity in terms of victimhood, like constantly, perpetually, and that can be harmful to students, right? So instead of historicizing the text all the time, Bracher says, always psychoanalyze. What does that mean? Roughly speaking, I can't speak to the complexities of his explanation at this point, but to me, what it means is that keeping in mind that our students have their identity needs, and my teaching of it, even if I am using history, should be offered in such a way where they can engage with that history with more of an interpersonal identity, right? And not start defining their own personal narratives through one aspect. As long as we can do certain things which enable them to see beyond that,